They mocked the obese maid. Then the handsomest man at the party did the unthinkable. Margaret Johnson held the tray with trembling hands as she tried to balance herself among the elegant guests circulating through the main hall of the Thompson mansion. At 52, she knew every corner of that house where she had worked for over 15 years, but that night everything seemed different. "Be careful with that tray, Margaret," whispered Susan, the other employee helping her serve the guests. "Mrs. Thompson is especially nervous today." The Thompson family's annual charity gala brought together New York City's high society. Margaret observed the stunning women in their expensive dresses, the imposing men in their impeccable tuxedos. She felt invisible in her black and white uniform, the yellow rubber gloves contrasting with the elegance around her. That's when she saw him. Christopher Anderson walked through the hall with the confident posture of someone born with a silver spoon. Tall, dark-haired, with green eyes that seemed to capture the light from the crystal chandelier. Heir to one of the country's largest fortunes, he was the most sought-after bachelor of the evening. "Look who just arrived," one guest whispered to her friend. "Prince Christopher. They say he'll choose a wife this year." Margaret quickly looked away. It wasn't her place to observe the employers or their guests. She had work to do. She better balance the tray of canapes that cost more than her monthly salary and moved toward the group of women chatting near the fireplace. "Excuse me?" she murmured, offering the appetizers. The women didn't even look at her. They continued talking about international trips and jewelry as if Margaret were part of the furniture. She was used to it. 15 years in that house had taught her to be patient. "How disgusting," said a voice behind her. "How do they let a person like that serve food?" Margaret felt her face grow hot. She knew they were talking about her weight, about her appearance. She tried to move on, but the voice continued. "Seriously, Patricia should be more careful about who she hires. Imagine if someone important sees this." "I agree," laughed another woman. "At least they could put her in the kitchen, out of sight of the guests." Margaret's heart was pounding in her chest. She pressed the tray against her body and tried to quicken her pace. It was in these moments that she remembered her mother's words. "Head held high, my daughter. No one can take your dignity from you." But the humiliation was far from over. Victoria Hamilton, a socialite known for her sharp tongue, appeared in front of her, blocking her path. "You shouldn't be here," Victoria said loudly, drawing the attention of other guests. "A party like this deserves staff that's up to par." "I'm just doing my job, Mom," Margaret replied softly, trying to get around the woman. "Your job?" Victoria laughed cruelly. "Look at the state of you. Sweating, panting. You must be contaminating the food." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Other guests began to approach, forming a small circle around the scene. Margaret felt like an animal on display at the zoo. Her hands began to tremble more intensely. "Please, I need to get through," she pleaded, her voice almost disappearing. "Oh, now she's in a hurry," Victoria mocked. "Maybe we should tell Patricia that her employee isn't up to the task." It was at that moment that Patricia Thompson appeared, drawn by the commotion. The lady of the house was an elegant 60-year-old woman, accustomed to keeping up appearances at any cost. "What's going on here?" asked Patricia, her eyes fixed on Margaret. "I was just telling the girls," said Victoria with a poisonous smile, "that perhaps you should reconsider your hiring standards. A party of this level requires a certain caliber." Patricia looked Margaret up and down, scrutinizing. The domestic worker could see the shame in her employer's eyes, the worry about what others would think. "Margaret," said Patricia coldly, "go back to the kitchen. Susan can finish serving the appetizers." "But Mrs. Thompson, I can continue." Margaret tried to protest. "Go to the kitchen, now." The humiliation was complete. Margaret lowered her head and began to walk away when Victoria decided to deliver the final blow. "Hold on there, fatty," she said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Aren't you even going to apologize for ruining our evening?" Margaret stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to shed in front of those people. "Apologize for what, ma'am?" "For existing," laughed Victoria, provoking malicious giggles from some of the other women. "For being an eyesore. for making us lose our appetites. It was at that moment that Margaret stumbled. Perhaps it was the nerves, perhaps her haste to get out of there, but her foot caught on the hem of her uniform and she lost her balance. The tray flew from her hands, scattering expensive canapés all over the marble floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stayed there on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her dignity and the appetizers. The laughter started quietly and grew until it became a cruel symphony of humiliation. "Now, yes," said Victoria between guffaws. "The show is complete." Margaret knelt and began to pick up the pieces, her tears finally escaping and falling onto the cold floor. The yellow gloves slipped on the shards, making everything even more difficult. "How pathetic," someone whispered. "Someone call the real cleaning lady," said another. "Patricia, for heaven's sake, you can't keep this here," complained Victoria. It was then that a different voice cut through the air, deep, firm, carrying an authority that made the entire room fall silent. "The pathetic show here isn't her." Margaret raised her eyes and saw Christopher Anderson approaching. His steps echoed on the marble as the guests moved aside to make way. He stopped right beside her and, to everyone's astonishment, knelt on the floor. "What are you doing?" whispered Patricia, horrified. Christopher didn't answer. He began picking up the canapés with his own hands, his expensive clothes getting dirty without him seeming to care. The guests were dumbfounded, not understanding what was happening. "Christopher," said Victoria, trying to maintain her composure, "you don't need to do that. She's just a domestic worker." He stopped picking up the pieces and looked directly at Victoria. His green eyes had an intensity that made the woman take a step back. "A domestic worker," he repeated slowly. "Do you know who this woman is?" "Of course not," Victoria laughed nervously. "Why would I?" Christopher stood up, helping Margaret to do the same. She was confused, not understanding why this important man was defending her. "Her name is Margaret Johnson," Christopher said for the entire room to hear. "She has worked in this house for 15 years. Before that, she worked in the Anderson family home for 10 years. Margaret's eyes widened. How did he know? How did he remember? "Chris," she whispered, using the nickname she gave him when he was a child. A gentle smile appeared on his face. "Hello, Aunt Margaret." The room erupted in confused murmurs. No one understood the connection between the millionaire heir and the humiliated domestic worker. "This woman," Christopher continued, his voice echoing throughout the space, "is the one who raised me when my parents traveled the world building the family empire. She taught me how to tie my shoes, comforted me when I had nightmares, took care of me when I was sick." Patricia turned pale. She knew the story of the Anderson family, knew that Christopher had lost his parents young and been raised by his grandparents, but she never knew the details. "When I was 7 years old," Christopher continued, looking directly at Margaret, "I came down with a severe case of pneumonia. The doctors said I needed a very expensive experimental treatment. My grandparents were traveling and couldn't get back in time." Margaret began to cry. She remembered those difficult days perfectly. "Do you know what this fat and pathetic woman did?" Christopher asked Victoria, his voice heavy with irony. "She sold all of her family's jewelry, an inheritance from 4 generations, sold everything to pay for my treatment." The silence was absolute. Even the sound of the waiter's footsteps had stopped. "She saved my life," Christopher said simply, "and she never told anyone, never asked for anything in return. When my grandparents returned and asked how the treatment had been paid for, she said she had gotten a loan." Margaret was sobbing now. "Chris, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did, Aunt Margaret, because for 15 years I've been looking for you. When I left to study abroad, I lost contact. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to repay you in some way. And today, by a twist of fate, I find you here." Patricia approached, visibly shaken. "Margaret, I didn't know. You never told me." "It wasn't important, Mrs. Thompson," Margaret replied softly. "What do you mean it wasn't important?" Christopher exploded. "This woman has dedicated her entire life to caring for others. She raised 3 orphaned nephews while working in 2 houses to support them. Never missed a day of work. Never complained, never asked for a raise. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. And you, Christopher turned to Victoria and her friends. Do you think you have the right to humiliate a person like that? Because of what? Her weight? Her appearance? Victoria tried to defend herself. We didn't know. Didn't know what? Christopher cut her off. That she was a human being who deserved respect? Do you need to know someone's story to treat them with dignity? The mood in the hall had completely changed. Some guests seemed genuinely ashamed, others still whispered among themselves, trying to process what they had just heard. Aunt Margaret, Christopher said, turning to her, I would like to talk with you. But first, there's something I need to do. He walked over to Patricia. Mrs. Thompson, with all due respect to your home and your hospitality, I cannot continue in an environment where people are treated in this way. Christopher, please, understand, Patricia began. I understand perfectly, and that's why I will take my leave. But before I do, I would like to extend an invitation. He looked at Margaret. Aunt Margaret, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? We have 15 years of conversation to catch up on. Margaret was speechless. She looked at Patricia, then at the other guests, and finally at Christopher. I don't know, Chris. It wouldn't be appropriate. Why wouldn't it be appropriate for one person to have dinner with another person she loves like a son? The words touched Margaret's heart deeply. During all those years caring for Christopher, she had truly developed a maternal love for him. And now she discovered he felt the same. But I don't have the proper clothes for Aunt Margaret, Christopher smiled. You could show up in your pajamas and you'd still be the most elegant person in the restaurant to me. Some guests smiled at the comment. The ice was beginning to break, but tension still hung in the air. It was then that an unexpected voice spoke up. Margaret! Everyone turned to see who was speaking. It was Jennifer Brooks, a woman of about 40 who had gone unnoticed among the guests until then. Margaret Johnson, Susan repeated, approaching. Yes, Margaret answered hesitantly. My God. Susan began to cry. I'm Susan Brooks. Do you remember me? Margaret studied the woman's face. There was something familiar, but she couldn't place it. I used to be Susan Miller, the woman continued. Mrs. Elizabeth Miller's daughter. You worked in our house when I was a teenager. Margaret's eyes widened. Susie? Little Susie? It's me. Susan smiled through her tears. Christopher watched the scene without fully understanding what was happening, but sensing there was another story there. My mother fired you when I was 16, Susan explained to the others. Said Margaret had stolen some jewelry. I knew it was a lie, but I was too young, too cowardly to confront her. The room grew tense again. Margaret lowered her head, reliving the humiliation of that time. The truth is, my mother had lost the jewelry gambling and needed a scapegoat. Margaret was fired without severance, without references, with her reputation stained. Susie, that was so long ago, Margaret tried to soften. No, Margaret, it wasn't just that. Susan moved closer. There's something you don't know, something I only found out after my mother passed away. All eyes turned to Susan, who took a deep breath before continuing. When I was 15, I went through a very difficult time. I was depressed, having dark thoughts. One night I almost did something very foolish. Margaret began to remember. There was one night she had found Susan crying in the garden, very late. Do you remember that night in the garden? Susan asked. I do, Margaret whispered. You found me and talked with me all night, made me see that life was worth living, gave me strength to carry on. Tears now streamed freely down Susan's face. You saved my life, Margaret, and the next day, my mother fired you for lying about the jewelry. I never knew about your suffering, dear, Margaret said, moving closer to embrace the younger woman. If I had known. You already did more than you realized, Susan replied. Thanks to that conversation, I sought help, got treatment, managed to move forward. Today I'm a psychologist and work with teenagers in crisis. Christopher was moved watching this revelation. Victoria and her friends seemed to grow smaller before the magnitude of what they were hearing. After my mother passed away, Susan continued, I found the jewelry hidden in the attic. along with a confession from her admitting what she had done to you. I spent years trying to find you to apologize and tell you the truth. Patricia approached, clearly shaken. Margaret, I didn't know any of this when I hired you 15 years ago. If I had known about the injustice you suffered, you gave me a chance when no one else would, Margaret replied. Even without references, even with my reputation stained, to me that was more than enough. No, Christopher intervened. It wasn't enough. Aunt Margaret, you deserve much more than just a chance. You deserve recognition. You deserve dignity. You deserve to be treated like the amazing person you are. Victoria, who had remained silent during the revelations, finally spoke up. Margaret, I need to apologize. What I said was terrible, unforgivable. It wasn't just the words, Christopher said coldly. It was the attitude. It was treating another human being as less important because of their appearance. You're right, Victoria admitted, genuinely remorseful. I have no excuse for what I did. Margaret looked at the woman who had humiliated her just minutes before. She could see the regret was sincere. Victoria, she said softly, we all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them. Margaret's generosity in the face of such humiliation left everyone impressed. Even Victoria was speechless in the face of such greatness of spirit. It was then that Christopher had an idea. Aunt Margaret, I need to ask you an important question. Do you still have dreams? Is there still something you'd like to do in life? Margaret was surprised by the question. Dreams? Chris, at my age, with my situation, age doesn't matter. Situations can change. Tell me, if you could choose anything in the world to do, what would it be? Margaret thought for a moment. It was a question no one had ever asked her. Well, she began hesitantly, I've always wanted to help other people like me. Women who work in homes, who face difficulties, who are humiliated or mistreated. I wish I could do something for them. What if I told you that's possible? How so? Christopher smiled. Aunt Margaret, I have a proposal for you. But first, I need everyone here to understand something. He addressed the entire room. What happened here today cannot happen again. It doesn't matter what someone's social position is, their appearance, their profession. Everyone deserves respect and dignity. You're right, said Patricia. And I apologize publicly, Margaret. I should have defended you from the start. I accept your apology, Mrs. Thompson. I know you were also in a difficult situation. Christopher then turned his attention back to Margaret. Aunt Margaret, I'd like to invite you to be my partner in a new project. We're going to create an institute for support and training for domestic workers. Partner? Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. But I don't understand anything about business. You understand life. You understand resilience. You understand these people's needs because you've been in their shoes. That's worth more than any diploma. Susan approached. Margaret, I can offer psychological support for the project. I know many domestic workers suffer emotional abuse. And I, said Patricia, surprising everyone, would like to make a donation to start the project. It's the least I can do to try to make up for what happened today. Even Victoria spoke up. I'd also like to contribute and volunteer to help with whatever is needed. Margaret was in shock. In a matter of minutes, her life had taken a complete turn, from a humiliated employee to a partner in a social project. I don't know if I can do it, Chris, she said, uncertain. Speaking in public, making important decisions. Aunt Margaret, you've already proven you can make the most important decisions. When you sold your jewelry to save me, when you raised 3 orphaned nephews, when you started over after being falsely accused. You're one of the strongest people I know. At that moment, other household staff began appearing at the entrance to the room. Susan, the other employee, David, the driver, Barbara, the cook. They had all heard what was happening and came to support Margaret. Mrs. Johnson, said Susan, the employee, we all know who you are. You've always defended us, always helped us when we needed it. It's true, confirmed David. When my wife got sick and I needed to take time off to take her to the doctor, it was Mrs. Johnson who covered for me so I wouldn't get fired. And when I was learning to cook and almost burned down the kitchen, laughed Barbara, it was she who taught me everything, with patience and kindness. Margaret was touched by her colleagues' support, but still had doubts. It was too much change to process at once. "Can I think about it?" she asked Christopher. "Of course, Aunt Margaret. But while you think, how about we have dinner tomorrow? I want to meet your nephews, see how they're doing, catch up." "They won't believe it," Margaret smiled for the first time that night. "Susan is finishing medical school, David graduated as an engineer, and Michael became a teacher. They all studied with great sacrifice, but they made it. I would love to meet them, and I'm sure they would be proud to know that the woman who raised them is going to become a social entrepreneur." The party had taken a completely different turn than planned. Instead of a night of frivolities, it had turned into a lesson in human values. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing, Victoria approached Margaret once more. "Margaret, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm going to change. What I saw here today made me realize the kind of person I've become. Victoria, we can all change. The important thing is to truly want to. Can I help with your project too? Not out of pity or guilt, but because I believe it's the right thing to do." Margaret looked into the eyes of the woman who had humiliated her. She saw sincerity there, a genuine desire to make amends. "Of course, dear. All help will be welcome." Christopher watched Victoria's transformation with interest. It was fascinating how a person could change when confronted with the reality of their own actions. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "regardless of your decision about the project, I want you to know one thing. To me, you have always been and will always be family. Nothing that happens will ever change that." The words touched Margaret's heart deeply. For years she had cared for other people's children as if they were her own, but she was never sure if she truly meant something to them. "Chris, you are like a son to me too, you always have been." Patricia approached the group. "Margaret, I would like to make a proposal. I know you might accept Christopher's project and leave this house, but while you are here, things will be different. You will be treated with the respect you have always deserved." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. But no matter how I am treated, I will always do my best at work." "It is exactly that attitude that makes you a special person," said Jennifer Brooks. "Margaret, may I tell everyone here something?" Margaret nodded. "During that night in the garden when I was going through my most difficult moment, Margaret didn't just talk with me. She took an old, worn-out Bible and read some verses about hope and new beginnings. Then she gave me the Bible and said, 'Whenever you feel lost, read this, and remember that God has better plans for you.'" "Do you still have the Bible?" asked Margaret, moved. Jennifer opened her purse and took out a small Bible, indeed worn by time. "I never parted with it. It went with me through college, the start of my career, all the difficult moments of my life." "My God," Margaret whispered. "It was my grandmother's Bible, the only thing of value I had left after I sold the jewelry." "And you gave it to a stranger, a girl who was suffering," said Christopher, even more impressed by the generosity of the woman who raised him. "She needed it more than I did at that moment." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was a silence of respect, of admiration, of people processing the greatness of character they were witnessing. It was then that David, the driver, spoke up. "Mrs. Margaret, may I also tell everyone what you did for my family?" Margaret tried to dissuade him. "David, it's not necessary." "Yes, it is, ma'am. People need to know who you really are." David addressed the guests. "My youngest daughter was born with a heart problem. She needed urgent surgery, but the insurance didn't cover it. I was desperate, not knowing what to do." He paused to control his emotion before continuing. "Mrs. Johnson found out about the situation and showed up at the hospital on the day of the surgery. She had paid for everything. Said she'd taken out a loan, but I later found out she'd pawned her mother's sewing machine, their only source of extra income." "David," Margaret tried to interrupt. "Let me finish, ma'am. My daughter is 10 years old now, healthy, plays like any other child, all thanks to you." Christopher was growing increasingly emotional as he discovered the extent of the kindness shown by the woman who had raised him. Aunt Margaret, how many people have you helped throughout your life? I only did what anyone would do. No, everyone said almost in unison. That's not what anyone would do. Barbara, the cook, also wanted to share her story. Mrs. Johnson taught me how to cook when I didn't even know how to fry an egg. She was patient with me, even when I messed everything up. Today, I'm known as one of the best cooks in the area. The revelations continued. Susan, the housekeeper, told how Margaret helped her finish her studies by paying for a prep course when she wanted to give up. Other household staff joined the group, each with a story of how Margaret had touched their lives. Patricia was visibly moved. Margaret, I had an incredible employee in my home and never knew it. I never stopped to ask, to really get to know you. You were always respectful to me, Mrs. Thompson. That was already a lot. But it wasn't enough. And today I learned that treating people well isn't just about not mistreating them. It's about caring, it's about valuing, it's about recognizing people's worth. Christopher approached Patricia. Mrs. Thompson, may I make a suggestion? Of course. What if we turned this party into something truly special? Instead of simply returning to the normal schedule, what if we used this moment to reflect on our values, on how we treat people? Patricia thought for a moment. You're right. Tonight has taught us more about humanity than any lecture or self-help book. It was then that Victoria had an idea. What if we made this a different kind of annual party? A party where we celebrate people like Margaret, people who make a difference in others' lives without expecting recognition. The idea was well received by those present. Christopher smiled. I like the idea, Victoria. And the first honoree would be our Aunt Margaret. No, Margaret protested. I don't deserve any honors. That's exactly why you do, said Jennifer Brooks. Truly special people never think they deserve recognition. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 young adults in the hall. Margaret recognized them immediately, and her face lit up. My boys, she exclaimed. They were the 3 nephews she had raised. Susan, now 28 and almost graduating from medical school. David, 26, a recently graduated engineer. And Michael, 24, a public school teacher. Aunt Margaret, said Susan the niece, are you okay? David called us saying something had happened at the party. I'm fine, my dears, more than fine. Christopher observed the 3 young people with interest. He could see in them the education, the values that Margaret had instilled. They didn't have the typical arrogance of young adults, but rather a noticeable humility and respect. You must be Aunt Margaret's nephews, Christopher said, approaching. I've heard a lot about you. You know our aunt? Asked David, the engineer nephew. She raised me when I was a child. My name is Christopher Anderson. The 3 looked at each other, surprised. They knew the Anderson family name, one of the most important in the country. Aunt, said Michael the teacher, what's happening here? Margaret looked around, seeing all the people who now surrounded her with respect and admiration. It was hard to explain how her life had changed in just a few hours. It's a long story, Michael, but to make it short, we discovered that sometimes the most important people are the ones we least expect. Christopher turned to the 3 young adults. Do you know how lucky you were to be raised by her? We do, said Emily, the niece, with tears in her eyes, as in her he. Our aunt gave up everything for us. She never married, never had children of her own, dedicated her whole life to taking care of us. And she never complained, added Brian. Even when we were going through hard times, when money was tight, she always found a way to make us smile. Our aunt is the most generous person in the world, said Michael, and the strongest too. When our parents died in an accident, she could have given us up for adoption, but she chose to take on the responsibility, even though she was so young. Christopher then learned that Margaret had taken in her nieces and nephews when she was only 22. She had sacrificed her youth, her chances of building a family of her own, to care for 3 orphaned children. Aunt Margaret, Christopher said, moved, you are even more amazing than I imagined. They are my pride, Margaret replied, looking at her nieces and nephews with love. Every sacrifice was worth it. Patricia approached the young adults. Margaret told me you all graduated from college. How did you manage to pay for your studies? Our aunt worked in 2 households, explained Emily. From early morning until late at night, And she still did extra cleaning on weekends to pay for our education. We tried to work to help, said Brian, but she wouldn't let us. She said our job was to study. And when we got jobs after graduating, Michael added, we wanted to help her, to lessen her workload. But she refuses to stop. She says work dignifies a person. Christopher smiled. That was exactly the kind of thing the Margaret he knew would say. Well, said Christopher, maybe I have a proposal she can't refuse. What proposal? The three asked in unison. Christopher explained the project for the Institute to support domestic workers. The three young adults were excited about the idea. Aunt, you have to accept, said Emily. It's the opportunity of a lifetime to do something even bigger for other people. But I don't know if I have the ability. Aunt Margaret, Brian interrupted. You raised 3 kids on your own, worked your whole life, overcame every hardship. If that's not ability, I don't know what is. And think of how many women you could help, said Michael. Women who are going through the same difficulties you went through. Margaret looked around. She was surrounded by people who believed in her, who saw in her qualities she herself doubted she possessed. Christopher, whom she had raised like a son. Jennifer Brooks, whose life she had saved. Patricia, who was learning to value her employees. Victoria, who was becoming a better person. And her 3 nieces and nephews, who were living proof that her sacrifices had been worth it. All right, she said finally. I'll try. The room erupted in applause. Even the guests who didn't know the full story were touched by the emotion of the moment. But, Margaret continued, I have one condition. What is it? Asked Christopher. I want the 3 of you to be part of the project too. Emily can help with the medical part, Brian with infrastructure, and Michael with education. The 3 nieces and nephews looked at each other and smiled. Of course, Aunt. We couldn't stay out of it. Christopher was radiant. His idea was becoming a reality in an even better way than he had imagined. Then it's decided, he said. We will create the Margaret Johnson Institute for Domestic Workers Support. No, Chris, Margaret protested. It can't have my name. Why not? Several asked at once. Because it's not about me. It's about all the people who need help. Christopher smiled. It was exactly this humility that made her the special person she was. So how about Dignity Institute? Suggested Jennifer Brooks. Perfect, agreed Christopher. The party continued, but now with a completely different atmosphere. The conversations were about social projects, about how each person could contribute to a fairer society. Margaret became the center of attention, but in a respectful and admiring way. During dinner, she sat at the main table, next to Christopher and his nephews and niece. It was the first time in 15 years that she wasn't serving at a party at the Thompson house. Aunt Margaret, said Christopher during dessert, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, dear. Have you ever regretted dedicating your life to others? Did you never want something just for yourself? Margaret thought for a moment before answering. You know, Chris, when I was young, I dreamed of having a family, children, a home of my own. But life gave me something different. It gave me you, it gave me my 3 nephews and niece. It gave me the opportunity to touch the lives of many people. But what about the loneliness, the sacrifices? I never felt alone. I always had people I loved around me. And as for the sacrifices, she looked at the nephews and niece. When I see the 3 men and woman you've become, I know it was worth every minute. Emily, the niece, began to cry. Aunt, you are the most amazing person in the world. You gave me much more than I gave you. You gave me purpose, you gave me love, you gave me a family. After dinner, Christopher and Margaret went out to talk in the garden. It was a beautiful night, with stars shining in the New York City sky. Aunt Margaret, can I confess something? Of course, dear. During all these years searching for you, I sometimes wondered if you had really existed, or if you were just an idealized memory from my childhood. And now, Christopher laughed. Now I see that you are even better than my memories. You are a real person, with flaws and qualities, but with a heart bigger than the world. And you, my dear, became the man I always knew you would be. Generous, fair, concerned about others. I learned from the best teacher. They walked in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their thoughts. Aunt Margaret, can I ask you for something? Anything. In the project we're going to create, could you teach me how you do it? How I do what? How you manage to see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. How you manage to forgive. How you manage to love unconditionally. Margaret smiled. That can't be taught, dear. That is lived. Every person who crosses our path teaches us something. Every difficulty makes us stronger. Every disappointment makes us more understanding. And when people hurt us, like Victoria did today, when someone hurts us, we have two choices. We can let the hurt make us bitter, or we can use that experience to be more empathetic with others who are suffering. Christopher nodded, understanding the wisdom of those words. Aunt Margaret, thank you. For what, dear? For saving me when I was a child, for teaching me values that no school could teach, for being you. Margaret hugged Christopher like she did when he was little. And thank you for finding me again, for giving me the opportunity to do something even bigger with my life. When they went back inside the house, they found a scene that moved them. The guests were organizing contributions for the future Dignity Institute. Patricia had prepared a list of donations, Victoria was coordinating a group of volunteers, and the household staff were sharing ideas about how the institute could operate. Look at that, whispered Christopher. One person transformed an entire party. It wasn't one person, Margaret replied. It was the power of truth. When we show who we really are, people respond. The party went on until late, but now it was a real celebration. A celebration of human dignity, of kindness, of the possibility of change. When it was time to leave, Margaret said goodbye to each person individually. To Patricia, she said, "Thank you for giving me a second chance in life." To Victoria, "Thank you for teaching me that we can all change." To Jennifer Brooks, "Thank you for showing me that small gestures can have big consequences." And to Christopher, "Thank you for reminding me that a mother never loses a son, even when he grows up and follows his own path." In the months that followed, the Dignity Institute became a reality. Margaret discovered she had a natural talent for administration and leadership. Hundreds of domestic workers were trained, got better jobs, and learned about their rights. The Institute offered not only professional training, but also psychological support, legal guidance, and most importantly, respect and dignity. Margaret made a point of getting to know every person who sought help, of listening to their stories, of showing them that they mattered. Christopher worked side by side with her, learning about social management, about how to turn resources into real opportunities for people in need. Margaret's 3 nieces and nephews also became deeply involved in the project. Susan, almost finished with medical school, created a preventive health program for the workers. David, the engineer, developed an infrastructure system that allowed the institute to run efficiently. Michael, the teacher, created educational programs that went beyond professional training. Victoria kept her promise to change. She became one of the institute's biggest advocates, using her social influence to attract more support and donations. She also started treating all the employees in her own home with much more respect and consideration. Patricia transformed her annual party into a celebration of people who make a difference in the community. Every year, domestic workers, teachers, nurses, and other essential professionals were honored. The party became one of the most respected social events in the city. Jennifer Brooks offered her services as a volunteer psychologist at the Institute. She developed a special program to help women who had suffered emotional abuse at work. Her personal experience made her understand perfectly what these women went through, but perhaps the most beautiful transformation was Margaret's own. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to dream beyond immediate needs. She started making long-term plans, thinking about her own future, and valuing her own achievements. "Aunt Margaret," Christopher said one day, 6 months after the party, "do you remember what you told me when I was a child? About everyone being important? I remember, and I still believe that. Do you finally understand that that includes you too?" Margaret smiled. "I'm learning, dear. After 52 years, I'm learning to value myself too." The Institute grew beyond all expectations. Other cities wanted to replicate the model. Margaret traveled all over the United States, sharing her experience, helping to create new branches of the Dignity Institute. In every city she visited, she found other Margarets, women who had dedicated their lives to caring for others, who had been made invisible by society, who deserved recognition and opportunities. 1 year after the party that changed her life, Margaret received an unexpected invitation. The government wanted to honor her with a medal of recognition for her services to society. "I don't know if I should accept," she confessed to Christopher. "I've always done everything out of love, not for recognition." "That's exactly why you should accept," he replied. "Not for you, but for all the other women like you. They need to see that it's possible to be recognized, to be valued." The medal ceremony was moving. Margaret went up on stage, accompanied by her 3 nephews and by Christopher. In the audience were Patricia, Victoria, Jennifer Brooks, and hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her. In her speech, Margaret said, "This medal isn't mine. It belongs to all the women who work quietly to make the world better. It belongs to the mothers who raise children that aren't their own. It belongs to the workers who clean our homes as if they were their own. It belongs to everyone who chooses love over resentment, generosity over selfishness." 2 years later, the Dignity Institute had already helped more than 5,000 people. Margaret had become a national reference in domestic workers' rights. Christopher gave up part of his business to dedicate himself fully to the social project. Margaret's 3 nephews also prospered in their careers. Susan graduated from medical school and opened a community clinic. David founded an engineering company focused on social projects. Michael became principal of a public school and revolutionized education in the region. Victoria completely changed her life. She sold some of her jewelry and expensive clothes to donate to the Institute. She began working as a full-time volunteer and discovered a fulfillment she had never felt in her life of frivolities. Patricia became one of the Institute's main funders and an active advocate for domestic workers' rights. She completely changed how she treated her employees and influenced other wealthy families to do the same. Jennifer Brooks expanded her psychological services and became a specialist in trauma related to domestic work. She wrote a book on the subject that became a reference in the field. But of all the transformations, the most beautiful was seeing Margaret discovering her own importance. She, who had always lived for others, finally understood that she too deserved care, love, and recognition. In an interview for a national newspaper, the reporter asked, "Mrs. Johnson, what was the most important moment of your life?" She thought for a moment and replied, "It wasn't when I received the medal from the government. It wasn't when I opened the institute. It was that night at the party when I finally understood that my worth didn't depend on others' approval, but on the love I carry in my heart." And what advice would you give to other women in your situation? That they never stop believing in themselves, that they remember that small acts of love can change the world, and that it's never too late to start over and discover new dreams. 3 years after the party that changed everything, Margaret was in the garden of her new house. Yes, she had finally bought her own house, when Christopher arrived for the Sunday lunch that had become a tradition. "Aunt Margaret, I have a surprise for you," he said, arriving accompanied by a beautiful and elegant woman. "This is Catherine, my fiancée," Christopher announced. "Catherine, this is the most important woman in my life, Margaret Johnson." Catherine hugged Margaret affectionately. "Christopher told me your story. It's an honor to meet you. He always says you're the person he admires most in the world." "What an exaggeration," Margaret laughed but was visibly moved. "It's not an exaggeration," said Catherine. "And I have a special request to make." "What is it?" "I'd like you to be my matron of honor. Christopher told me you were the mother he never had. It would mean so much to both of us." Margaret began to cry. After a lifetime of taking care of others, she was finally being included as real family. "It would be an honor," she replied, hugging both young people. The wedding was beautiful. Margaret was radiant in her matron of honor dress, surrounded by everyone she loved. Her 3 nieces and nephews, Patricia, Victoria, Jennifer Brooks, and dozens of people whose lives she had touched. During the party, Christopher made an emotional toast. "Today we celebrate the love between Catherine and me, but we also celebrate the unconditional love of the woman who taught me what real love is." Margaret Johnson, thank you for saving my life when I was a child and for continuing to save lives every day. Margaret stood up to respond to the toast. My dears, you gave me a family I never thought I would have. You taught me that love has no limits, that kindness begets kindness, and that it's never too late to start over. She looked around, seeing all the faces she loved. A few years ago, I was just an invisible maid. Today, I am a businesswoman, a social activist, a matron of honor, and most importantly, deeply loved. This taught me that our story never ends as long as we are alive to write it. The hall erupted in applause. Victoria approached Margaret and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that a person can completely change." "Thank you for having the courage to change," Margaret replied. Patricia also approached. "Margaret, you transformed my home, my life, and my way of seeing the world. And you gave me the opportunity to start over when I needed it most." The party continued into the late hours. Margaret danced for the first time in years, laughed until her stomach hurt, and felt completely full and happy. When she got home that night, she looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the same woman as always, but now she saw with different eyes. She saw a strong, courageous woman, capable of transforming lives and of transforming herself too. On her nightstand was the photo Christopher had given her, the two of them together when he was a child. She was young, both smiling. Next to it, a recent photo, the whole family she had built over her lifetime. Before going to sleep, as she did every night, she gave thanks. She thanked the difficulties that made her strong, the people she loved and who loved her back, the opportunities she knew how to seize even when they arrived late. And most of all, she thanked having learned that it's never too late to discover that we are special, that we deserve love, respect, and all the good things in life. 5 years after the party that changed everything, Margaret Johnson was on stage in a large auditorium in Washington, D.C., speaking to an audience of over 1,000 people about domestic workers' rights. The Dignity Institute had become a national reference. Christopher was in the front row, applauding proudly. Next to him, Catherine held their 2-year-old little William in her lap, who called Margaret Grandma. Yes, she had finally become a grandmother, even if not by blood. Her 3 nieces and nephews were also present. Susan had just opened her second community medical clinic. David was building a housing complex for low-income families. Michael had been elected the city's Secretary of Education and was revolutionizing public education. During her speech, Margaret said, "A few years ago, a woman told me I was an offense to the eyes. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who learned to love herself, who discovered her worth, and who uses her story to inspire other people. It doesn't matter where you were born, how much money you have in the bank, or what clothes you're wearing. What matters is the size of your heart and your willingness to do good. If you're going through difficulties, remember, your story isn't over. As long as there is life, there is a possibility for a new beginning, for growth, for transformation." The audience rose in applause. Backstage, Victoria waited for her turn to speak. She had become one of the main advocates for domestic workers' rights and would share the stage with Margaret. "Ready?" asked Margaret. "Ready. And Margaret, thank you for showing me who I can really be. Thank you for choosing to be that person." 10 years after the party, Margaret received an honorary doctorate from a prestigious university. Her speech was about the University of Life, lessons learned in caring for others. "I never set foot in a college as a student," she said, "but life taught me more than any diploma could. It taught me that kindness is a universal language, that respect costs nothing, and that love multiplied always comes back." 15 years later, at 67, Margaret published her autobiography, Yellow Gloves, a story of dignity and resilience. The book became a bestseller and inspired millions of people across the country. In the dedication, she wrote, "To all the women who clean the world so others can dream, to all who choose love even when they receive contempt, and especially to Christopher, who taught me that a child doesn't need to be born from our womb to be born from our heart." 20 years after the party that changed her life, Margaret Johnson was invited to give a talk at a school in New York City. The children were fascinated by her story. "Aunt Margaret," asked a 10-year-old girl, "do you regret anything in your life?" Margaret thought for a moment. You know, sweetheart, I regret taking so long to discover my own worth. If I could give advice to my younger self, I'd say, you are important, you deserve respect, you can dream big. And what is your greatest pride? Asked a boy. It's not the awards I've received or the institute I helped create. My greatest pride is the people I've helped discover their own strength. Every life we touch touches other lives, and so we create a chain of good. At the end of the talk, the children lined up to hug Margaret. A girl whispered in her ear, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." "No, sweetheart," Margaret replied. "Be better than me. Be yourself, but with lots of love in your heart." Today, at 70, Margaret Johnson divides her time between the Dignity Institute, which now has branches across the United States, and her family. Christopher and Catherine had 2 more children, all raised knowing the story of Grandma Margaret and learning values of respect and solidarity. Her 3 nephews built beautiful and successful families. All attribute their success to the values Margaret taught them. The most beautiful thing is that they passed those same values onto their children. Patricia, now 80, became one of the country's leading funders of social projects. Victoria founded her own NGO and dedicates her life to the cause of domestic workers. Jennifer Brooks became a renowned psychologist and author of several books on resilience and human dignity. On her last birthday, Margaret was surprised with a party organized by all the people whose lives she had touched. Over 1,000 people attended, each with a story of how she had made a difference in their lives. During the party, Christopher gave an emotional speech. "Today we celebrate 70 years of the most extraordinary woman I know. Margaret Johnson taught us that greatness isn't measured by what we have, but by what we give. That beauty isn't in appearance, but in character. That success isn't what we accumulate, but how many lives we can positively touch." Margaret, surrounded by her entire chosen family, looked around and smiled. Her journey had begun with humiliation at a gala, but had transformed into a life of purpose, love, and fulfillment. In her thank you speech, she said, "If I could go back to that night 15 years ago and choose not to go through the humiliation, I wouldn't, because it was that which led me to discover who I really was." Sometimes our most difficult moments are the portals to our greatest transformations. Today, I am a fulfilled woman, not because I am rich or famous, but because I discovered my worth, built a family of love, and dedicated my life to making a difference. And that, my dears, is priceless. The party continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and many stories. Margaret danced with Christopher like they used to when he was a child, told stories to her honorary grandchildren, and received affection from hundreds of people she had inspired. When she got home, she looked at herself in the mirror one more time. She saw a 70-year-old woman with graying hair and wrinkles from smiling so much. But most of all, she saw a woman who had learned to love herself, who had built a life of meaning, and who had proven that it's never too late to discover our dreams. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Margaret made the right decisions? We would love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.